Good day, everyone. So, why do you have some of the interpersonal relationships you have? Why do you have the friend who you're completely opposite from, but somehow you get along? Why do you have an intimate partner that you've broken up with and you're back together again? Why do you have a parent that you really enjoy being around, but you also find frustrating because they're still trying to be your parent and not a friend? I don't know if any of those circumstances describe you, but they describe a lot of people's situations, and a lot of people's situations having to do with their interpersonal communication. So that's what I'll be handling in our online class today. Basically, the subject is interpersonal communication. When I'm done, what I would like you to know is how interpersonal relationships are facilitated. That's a fancy way of saying how people come together into interpersonal relationships. That's what I want you to know. A big part of it, of course, is nonverbal communication. So what I have in store for you are basically three things I'm going to be talking about in our video lecture today for our online version of the course. The first thing I'm going to talk about is communicating in interpersonal relationships. It also happens to be chapter 7. Then I'm going to go into building common ground in interpersonal relationships. That's chapter 8. That's our second main point. And then I'm going to be wrapping things up in this shortened video lecture with a third idea, which is appreciating and using nonverbal communication. So those are the three subjects, and then you'll have some discussion questions online that I'll be asking you to answer by the end of class tonight on Tuesday. Okay, so let's just take on the first subject, communication in interpersonal relationships. We know that the interpersonal communication has some basic characteristics. For example, we know that it's personalized. The way that we refer to other people, we use nicknames in our last class. It's very personal. We say things that are special between us and the other people in our lives, and that helps to make the relationship special when we use a kind of code word with somebody else, like a nickname, or we use a certain saying, or we say something that was funny, that was random, and it now becomes a word that we just throw at the other person. They just start cracking up because it reminds you of a funny time you had together. We also know, secondly, that interpersonal communication occurs in a relationship. It's not a stranger that you have interpersonal communication with most of the time. It's somebody that you have a history with. You've been together with them over time. You've been different places. You've grown up sort of together. You've grown maybe together. You have a relationship with a person. That's where your interpersonal communication occurs. Lastly, we know that interpersonal communication is very much influenced by gender and culture. Much of the ways that we've already used those two dimensions in our class to describe how you end up being a different communicator. We know that if you grow up as an American, for example, the way that you have interpersonal communication is overall very direct. You ask a person if they're upset with you, for example, rather than hoping that they'll tell you if they are. That's something that comes out of being American. We know that Japanese people, just to give a different example of a different culture, generally speaking, when they meet somebody on a business trip, they don't want to know about the business that the person is involved in. They don't want to be sold something right away. Instead, what they want to do is they want to get to know a person's family. So we know that our communication is different interpersonally according to our gender and our culture. Now let's take on the subject of intimacy. Intimacy has a lot to do with interpersonal communication. Intimacy is a combination of breadth and depth. When you have breadth and depth to your relationship, you have intimacy. Breadth is how many different experiences you've had together with the other person. Have you been in a classroom, but you've also been to the beach, and you've been to meet their parents, and you've been to a baseball game, and you've done a road trip together. Those are a lot of different experiences with a lot of variety to them. That's breadth when you start to have those experiences. Depth has to do with the amount and the type of interaction that you have with the other person. Do you get into their family history? Do you discuss some of their fears that they have in life? Fear of bridges, fear of elevators. Do you know about their interpersonal relationships with other romantic partners? Do you know what they've done together, so to speak? This is depth. It's how far down into a person's personality do you go when you communicate with them. That's both of those two things together, breadth and depth together, they make up intimacy. Now let's talk about interpersonal attraction and why we're attracted to different people. One reason that we're attracted to others is because they're similar to us. They remind us of the things that we like about ourselves. If you happen to be a golfer, you like somebody who also plays golf, and you can chat about it. If you're a person who loves pasta or pizza, you strike up a friendship with somebody who also likes pizza. We like those sometimes who are similar. It brings us together. Another reason that we are attracted to people is because they're familiar to us. People who wear shirts and shoes and shorts and other kinds of clothing that look like where we come from. I was just in Pittsburgh this past weekend. Everybody was wearing black and gold. A person who's very Pittsburgh oriented, they're going to feel more comfortable around people wearing black and gold. It's very much a part of a Pittsburgh person's personality. So we like those sometimes who are familiar. And sometimes that means that our friendships are born out of high school. We don't always keep those relationships, but the person you rode on the bus with, the person who grew up on the same street as you, the person who you saw around town all the time, liking those who are familiar. Next up, we also like those who are attractive, people who we perceive to be good looking. There's a chemical reaction that goes on when we're around somebody who's good looking. We start to secrete certain bodily fluids, and we get certain feelings going, and our pulse goes up when we're around somebody who's attractive, and that makes it sometimes possible to have an interpersonal relationship with them. And the attraction doesn't have to just be physical, though that's what I've described. It can also be mental. One of my early best friends in college was 5 years older than me, and I just was really attracted to his way of thinking because he had so much more experience than me. He had hitchhiked across the United States, and I just really liked to get his take on what he thought about people, basically. Now let's talk about communication and relationship development. That is how people come together into an intimate relationship through communication. And we have two main stages. One is the coming together stage. The other is the moving apart stage, which doesn't always happen, but we have to talk about it. The coming together stage involves initiating. That's where somebody makes an effort to strike up a relationship. It could be you just sit next to a person. It could be you send them a text. It could be that you actually ask them if they want to walk downtown with you. It's somebody has to make the first move. That's what initiating is. After that comes an experimenting phase. An experimenting phase is where you try both of you to find out what you have in common. Do you like to get up early? No. Oh, well, I do. Do you like to go for walks outside in the woods? Yeah, I do. Oh, so do I. You start to find things that the other person and you share in common that you both like to do. Most of your talk is about those things that you both like. Really? I lived there too once. That's the way that you're talking when you're experimenting. That then can give way to the third phase, which is integrating. Now your lives are becoming more intertwined when you are integrating. You leave clothes over each other's house. You borrow the other person's car. You borrow their phone. Maybe even you start to stay over there and then end up living there. Your lives are intertwined. It's as if your plans hardly ever include yourself anymore. They're including the other person. You're always thinking about the other person, and sometimes it's just assumed. You just do something every Friday night. You don't say anything about it, but that's the way your lives have become. That's the integrating phase. And then if that goes further, it leads to the final phase, which is the bonding phase, the final phase of coming together. This is where you make a long-term commitment to that person. You decide, for example, that you're going to get engaged, or you decide that you're going to be monogamous and you're only going to date each other. Or the ultimate, I guess some people would consider to be the ultimate, is you decide to get married. Or you decide to have a partnership and you're going to have all the rights and privileges of living together, but you're not going to get married. All of these are examples of commitment. They all speak to that final phase of coming together, bonding. Then there is, sadly for some, but happily for others, the moving apart phase, the moving apart stage of coming together in a relationship. And the moving apart can be painful, but it happens as part of life. And the first phase of moving apart is differentiation. That's where instead of talking about differences with each other, you start to talk, instead of talking about similarities with each other, you start to talk about differences. See, you're the kind of person that likes to go out and be social, and I'm more to myself. I like to stay, to myself and watch a movie with somebody. That's my idea of a good time. You're talking about those things in that way. You're talking about differences. You're talking about the things that you don't have in common more than you're talking about what you do have in common. That phase can then give way to circumscribing. Circumscribing is where you start to push the other person away from certain areas that you don't want to talk about. So they ask you about the people that you have been involved with before, and you're like, I don't want to talk about that. They ask you about your father, who's no longer in the picture, so to speak. I don't want to talk about it. You start to protect certain areas that you don't want them to get into, and you tell them it's off limits to you. That's what circumscribing is. That can then lead to the third phase, which is stagnating. And this is when your interaction flattens out. You start to do the same old thing all the time. And so you may say to the person, what do you want to do tonight? And they say, I don't know. What do you want to do? You say, I don't know. What do you want to do? And you can't come up with anything. You're so used to the routine. It doesn't feel inspiring, but yet nobody wants to end it. You're happy with the familiarity, so to speak, but you still feel there's a boring quality to your relationship. Next up can come then the avoiding phase, and that's where you start to try not to run into the other person. If you would normally take a certain route walking to class and you're likely to bump into them, you take a different route. If they call you on the phone, you look at caller ID, you see they're calling, you don't pick up, and you don't answer their texts, and you just make sure that you're avoiding them as much as possible. You go to different parties than they go to, different places. That is the avoiding phase. And then eventually that might lead to the final phase of coming apart, the terminating phase. This phase can go back and forth. You can terminate, get back together, terminate, get back together. There's a lot of emotions going on during this phase, a lot of feelings of guilt, regret, but actually there can be feelings of freedom, your freedom away from somebody that you didn't want to be involved with anymore if that happens. And of course there's a feeling of loneliness, even if you knew that it was right to not be with a person anymore. So these then are the stages of communication and relationship to communication relationship development. Now let's go on to our second main point for today, which is building common ground in interpersonal relationships. And we know that differences between people can arise in any given situation. I mean, you and I may have a difference some night about a grade that I've given you for a class, and you may have a difference with when you pull into the parking garage with somebody who you thought was there after you, and they took your spot anyhow. They forced their car into your spot. These kind of things happen all the time. And so conflict is something that is very natural to human beings. And I don't want you to think of conflict as only that something bad, because most people do think of conflict as uncomfortable at best and destructive at worst. And when we have that conflict or those disagreements that are the basis of conflict, it makes the quality of our communication different. We sometimes don't bring subjects up that we think will fuel the conflict, or sometimes we do bring subjects up that we know will fuel the conflict because that's what we want. We want to rise out of the other person. Conflict is something that's normal, natural, but it does add discomfort. We know that conflicts are handled differently in different families. Some families have a kind of a yelling approach. They have loud outbursts, and when conflict comes up, people get all hot and bothered, and maybe they calm down, maybe they don't. Other people, conflict results in the silent treatment, where you're in a household with somebody and they're purposely not talking to you. It depends a lot on the family that you grew up in, the style of conflict that you have. One good thing about conflict now is to make sure that we talk about why it is good to have in a relationship, because you don't grow unless you do have some kind of conflict, is it does establish boundaries and norms. We know that if you take something from somebody, a sweatshirt, and they say, hey, did you take my sweatshirt? Just that question will tell you that's not okay if they said it with that kind of tone. So it describes a boundary. It may be okay for you to take 50 cents in coins, but it's not okay for you to take their clothes. That's a different kind of thing. You're wearing something of theirs. So conflicts do establish norms. Conflicts also allow you to express your feelings. All of us have feelings. Human beings feel things a lot. And it's important for us to get those feelings out. Sometimes we can feel very resentful if we don't, or we can feel that we never have had the chances that others have had to let our feelings out, and so we feel that there's an inequity in the way that we're treated compared to the way others are treated. So it's very important to get those feelings out, and conflict allows you to do that. It allows you to get anger out, allows you to get happiness if you resolve things. It allows you to get regret out, or sorrow. There's a whole bunch of feelings that can come out with conflict. Conflict also can restore the balance of power to a relationship. If you've been in a relationship for too long where you're the weaker one, the decisions are made by the other person, you're made to feel maybe not as smart, or at least you allow yourself to feel that way. Conflict can restore that if you start to create some open dissatisfaction with the way things are between you, and hopefully there's conversation and you're able to restore some of the balance and power that you didn't think was there. Also, conflict can build survival into a relationship. If you have a relationship where you've never had a conflict, it can be kind of a shocker when you have that first conflict. It's like, oh my God, we've never had that before. Is it going to fall apart? But actually, if you survive that, now you're prepped for future conflicts when really serious things happen, like deaths in the family or car accidents or differences over money. Those are kinds of the big subjects can be better handled if you've already had conflict. Now we're going to go on to the idea that there's a difference between conflict that occurs in a high context culture versus one that occurs in a low context culture. High context cultures is where people expect others to figure out the implicit meanings because the context is so high, it's so clear. And so in China, for example, when you go into a room, you see that people go over to the male who's sitting at the head of a table, who's the most important person in the room, and he's maybe an executive at a company, or maybe he is just a father, or not just, maybe he's a father, or maybe he is a dean at a university. He's got a high status position, it's the highest one there, and people go over to pay their respects to him. That's the way that a high context culture operates in China regarding interpersonal communication. So if you don't go over to speak to him, he's going to maybe ignore you just a little bit. He's not going to tell you that you didn't act appropriately. He's going to ignore you a little bit. Now you're left to figure out on your own. Oops, I should have gone over and said hello to him. That's a high context culture. Meanings are implicit. In a low context culture, meanings are explicit because you don't have the context. So you walk into a room and there's the class that you thought was supposed to be held there, but it turns out it looks like it's a different professor and a different subject that's on the board. So you turn to the person next to you and you ask them what class this is, and they're like, I don't know. And you say, do you know who the professor is? I don't know. And they're starting to get a little bit irritated with you, and eventually they're going to say to you, I don't know anything because this is my first class too. So now they're telling you something that is direct because the context is low. American culture, generally speaking, is a low context culture. Because we have so much diversity in this country, it's tough to know exactly what expectations are of us when we're with people that we're meeting for the first time, especially if they come from different backgrounds. And so we tend to be very direct people. That's why you walk into a store, it's totally natural to say to the store clerk, where's the dish soap? Before you say hello, before you say good afternoon, before you say how are you, where's the dish soap? You're being very direct because the context of the store, you can't figure it out. You don't see those kinds of products sold in the places that you've looked. All right, now we're going to go on to ask you to identify your conflict management style. One conflict management style that some people have is coercion. That's where you kind of force somebody else, either psychologically or physically, to accept your point of view. In couples, sometimes sex is withheld until the other person comes around. That's kind of coercion. Sometimes if you're in an argument, you leave the room. That's kind of coercion. You're saying, I'm not going to talk to you until you agree with me. With parents and kids, sometimes it's just out and out coercion. You say, listen, if you want the piece of cake, you've got to eat your greens. That's coercion. It's not really giving the child a choice. It's a kind of conflict management style. It sometimes works, but sometimes it doesn't. It does imply punishments are going to be involved if the other person doesn't go along. A second kind of conflict management style is persuasion. And that's where you try to persuade somebody to change their point of view, but you make it so that they still have their choice, and they feel that way. So I sat down with my daughter today to look at college classes at Millersville. She's already got her schedule. And I said to her, this is my thought. It goes under the category of do what you want as long as you're happy. But you may want to consider double majoring. You're already majoring in English education, which is going to let you teach. But you also said you really would like to write for the web. So there's another major that's called a multidisciplinary studies major in writing for digital media. I think you ought to think about it. That's me trying to use a persuasive conflict style. Now, the reason I even call it conflict is because I know that my daughter could reach a point where she's like, all right, Dad, I'll figure it out on my own. So I'm trying a persuasive style to say, hey, here's some of the things that I know already. You can use it if you want. It's up to you. It really is okay if you don't use it. That's persuasion. A third management style of conflict is collaboration. This is where you work with others to reach agreement. Sometimes you have to get another party involved. An arbitrator or a judge sometimes handle custody disputes between parents. That would be collaboration if both parents allow the judge to make that decision. Sometimes it's at a much more innocuous in a more innocuous kind of context. You want to get in the front car or the front seat of the car, and so does somebody else. So you say, hey, I'll take the front seat on the way there, you take it on the way back, and you're like, yeah, that's good. Okay, you've just managed conflict through collaboration. The last kind of conflict management style is compromise, and that's where each party gives up something to reach the compromise. And so you wanted to go down the beach on Saturday, they wanted to go down on Friday, so you end up leaving late Friday night because they had to work. The thing with compromise is neither party ever really feels totally happy because they feel that they've given up something, they've lost something. So the Friday person feels like they've lost half a day, the Saturday person maybe feels rushed. So that's something to think about. All right, and now finally we're going to talk about how to handle conflict constructively. And it's not always easily done because the heat of our emotions gets in the way, and sometimes we do things that we regret and know that we shouldn't have done. But if you can remain rational, try and stay focused on what the most reasonable thing is instead of responding to somebody else's hurt of you in a comment that they made, called you a name, or said that you were always this way, and then you got upset and you're starting to respond to that instead of just thinking about what is the rational thing to do here. That's one thing. A second thing is to try and understand their point of view. Really think about it. A lot of times we think that we've heard this person that we're conflicting with say the same thing over and over and over, but really try and understand what's it like from their point of view. You know, if you are having an argument with somebody that you're living with and it's about cleanliness, about keeping the place neat enough for what you like, try and understand for them. Okay, they grew up in a big family, and it was tough to keep the house clean, so there's a lot of stuff laying around. You know, now you're understanding them. Maybe you're not reacting so emotionally to them. Next up, try and separate the person from the issue. Don't say, for example, you know, you're always yelling at me. And they say, no, you're not. You're always yelling at me. That's when you're making the person the issue. Instead, you could say, why don't we both try and keep the volume down while we're trying to solve this situation? Because it's really a situation that we need to fix because we can't decide where we're going to go together. So let's try and focus on deciding that instead of telling each other what we're doing wrong. When you do those kinds of things, you're keeping the issue front and center rather than the other person. When another person feels it's about them, they're going to get defensive. They're going to defend themselves, say, no, I'm not. I did it before. It wasn't me this time. Those are the kinds of ways that people talk when they're defensive. All right, now we're going to go on to our third main point for today, which is appreciating and using nonverbal communication. And I did mention in a prior class that more than half of the meaning that we get from our interaction is from others using their nonverbal communication. So a simple smile and thumbs up can have a lot more meaning than actually hearing, I'm happy and the day is going very well. You know, we get a lot more from nonverbal communication. And nonverbal communication is especially helpful when we're in a foreign country. We can use our hands to signal what it is that we're looking for. No, I'm looking for something long and thin and, it sits on a shelf like that. Use your hands to tell things. All right, so let's talk some more about nonverbal communication. It's very, very important because if you want to understand communication, you have to understand nonverbal cues, not just other people's, but your own. And that's something that sometimes people are unaware of, is how they come across nonverbally. So let's talk about the basic characteristics of nonverbal communication first. And one is there's a paradox here. A paradox is something that doesn't quite fit. The paradox is we're using words to discuss nonverbal communication. So that's a paradox, right? Because we're using something to describe something else, and that something else does not communicate that way. Using words is exactly the opposite, non-words. So we know that that's true about a basic characteristic of nonverbal communication. We also know that nonverbal communication can either be spontaneous or planned. It can be planned if you're going to have a job interview and you're planning to shake the person's hand, and you're planning to stand up and they tell you to sit. That's planned nonverbal communication. But it can also be spontaneous if something just makes you laugh and you start to crack up. Even if it's a person falling down, you don't mean to laugh, but they look silly. And as long as they're not hurt, at least you hope, you're going to laugh, and you didn't plan it, but it just came out. Same thing with anger. People get, they reach their boiling point and they start yelling. They didn't mean to. They didn't think they were going to, but something set them off. So nonverbals can be spontaneous or planned. Nonverbals also can be either instantly recognizable or they can be unclear. If somebody's crying and they're in a distance, are they crying because they're happy or are they crying because they're sad? Sometimes we don't know until we explore further. And finally, nonverbals can either reveal our feelings or they can conceal our feelings. If you get pulled over by a police officer and you know that you don't have your driver's license with you, then maybe you're going to give a stone face, so to speak. Yes, officer, can you tell me what I was doing? You're trying to not reveal that you're scared that if they're going to ask you for your driver's license. And so you give them a face that does not express very much. That's concealing with nonverbal communication. The opposite might be if they come up and you're all very upset and you maybe even crying and say, I know, I'm sorry, I don't have my license. Maybe most people wouldn't respond that way, but just as an example. Next up, we know that nonverbal communication is not a language. A language has rules to it. There are lots of rules about our language that have to do with sentence construction. We've discussed some of those rules in class. Nonverbal communication doesn't have that. There is no syntax. There is no order of what we do our communication is. And therefore, nonverbal communication is more general and less precise than verbal communication. We also know that nonverbal communication is intricately linked to our emotions, very linked to our emotions. If you're nervous, you might start squirming in your seat. It's not something you have control over. It's the squirming is related to the fact that you're nervous. If you feel bad for a friend who lost a family member, you put your arm around them. You're feeling the pain that they're feeling, and they're hopefully feeling your empathy from them. So this leads us, because nonverbals are so tied to our emotions, it leads us to perceive of nonverbal communication generally as more truthful than verbal communication. Did you see the way she looked? She does not like me. And you're so certain about it because you believe that the nonverbal has given her away. Therefore, if there's a conflict between the nonverbal communication and the verbal communication, we tend to believe the nonverbal. Like asking your friend, how's it going? And they say, I'm fine, but they look down. They look down, and now you're thinking, no, they're not fine. They said they're fine, but they're not fine. I'm going to believe the not fine nonverbal, and I'm going to ask them another question. All right, now let's go on to how nonverbal communication is highly contextual, which means that it depends a lot on the particular situation. If you pull your head, if you pull somebody underneath your chin, and somebody sees that, somebody may not know whether you're doing that because you're trying to console somebody or whether you're trying to dominate them. It depends on the context. We know that most relational messages between two people, because of their context, are non-verbally driven. Most of the messages, therefore, that we send about the other person in terms of how we're getting along and whether we belong together are nonverbal. The way that you kiss somebody, the way that you hug somebody, how close you sit to them, how often you look at them and notice them, that sort of tells the other person the health of your relationship more than words do, because nonverbal communication is highly situational. We also know that nonverbal communication is highly influenced by culture and gender. For example, students in Thailand, they sit with their feet flat on the floor. If they don't, it's a sign of disrespect. So you're never kicking at your feet, you're never kicking back and putting your feet up. Feet are always on the floor. We know that Mexican men almost always wear pants. It used to be illegal during Napoleon's time. Napoleon occupied Mexico for you not to wear pants, and it's just kind of a holdover. So even though you have 95 degrees in Mexico, Mexican men are still wearing pants. We know that British people give a weaker handshake than Americans, which leads Americans somehow to feel that they've held a wet rag or something very, very strange feeling. We know that Chinese people burp after a good meal to show their appreciation. And we know, as we've discussed in class, that Americans always smile for photographs. These are ways that we communicate nonverbally by virtue of where we grew up and what culture. We also know that gender influences nonverbal communication. However, we know that men tend to display anger in response to jealousy. If they're jealous, they get angry rather than just expressing jealousy, whereas a woman tends to express sadness, generally speaking, sadness when she experiences jealousy rather than anger. Now, feel free to disagree with that. This is what the book claims. I'm just trying to mention that we do have some gender stereotypes when it comes to interpersonal communication that's nonverbal. We also know that generally speaking, when women tend to notice nonverbal communication more than men. I took my wife to see a concert this weekend, the Rolling Stones in Pittsburgh, and she says to me, these guys next to me are making me nervous. Well, to be honest, I didn't even know there were two guys next to her. They just weren't on my radar, but she didn't like their body language. She thought that maybe they were doing drugs at the concert, so she decided to, pay more attention to them. Their nonverbals is something that she picked up on. It's very, very common for women to see nonverbals more than men. We know that in female conversations between female, that women tend to stand closer to females than men stand close to men. We also know that men tend to speak more loudly than women. Again, you can disagree with that. We know that men tend to stand closer together in mixed gender groups. When there's men and women, men stand closer than they stand next to men in just male-only groups. We know that women tend to initiate touching more than men. They tend to touch your arm, your shoulder, your elbow, your forearm more than men, as an example. Again, it's a general statement. Next up is the idea that nonverbal communication is continuous. You have a start and a stop to a sentence. That's verbal communication. It's not continuous. But nonverbal communication is, even before I finish this video, you're going to be looking at my body posture, my final facial reaction, then I'm going to hit stop on the phone, and I'm still communicating nonverbally. You're always communicating nonverbally. It's always continuous. Now let's move to what are some of the functions of nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication, first of all, helps to accent communication, helps to make it stronger. I am not going home this weekend. Okay, I can see you really mean it. Your pounding on the table is emphasizing the not in that case. It's accenting it. You're drawing attention to the word that has the most importance, in this case, not. But nonverbal communication can also complement verbal communication. It is so good to see you. And now you give a hug, which only complements. It goes along with the verbal communication. Yes, it access it, but here it's complementing it as well. It's going along with it. We also know that nonverbal communication can contradict communication. It goes against what somebody's saying. So a football player takes a rough tackle on the field, and somebody on the sideline yells out, "You all right?" And they say, "Yeah." And then they walk off the field with a limp. It's a contradiction. Doesn't make sense. They said that they were all right, but the limp says they're not all right. And there's a certain term that we use also to describe this kind of communication, contradictory nonverbal communication. That's called leakage. And that's when your verbal communication gives you away. You don't mean it to, but it gives away what you're really thinking, which conflicts with what you're saying. So police officers, when they pull somebody over, if you watch the show Cops, you'll see this, they always try to look the person in the eye. And if the person doesn't look them in the eye, and then they ask them if they have anything on the vehicle, anything illegal in the vehicle, and they say no, then they're looking at the conflict and the leakage coming out through their lack of eye contact, and then maybe they're going to order a search. Next up, as a function of nonverbal communication, is that it regulates verbal communication. It sort of controls the flow of it. Somebody who talks too long, you put your finger up, you say, the finger says you want to speak, so they stop. You've just stopped their communication by putting the finger up. Somebody who wants to tell you something exciting, they say, "I've got something to tell you," and then they take a long time to tell